invitation, first of all, and then for the very nice introduction. I want to say that it's really humbling to be in front of so many people who are so knowledgeable about something where, as any of us would know, I've only scratched the surface. I mean, there's so much more that can be done and probably has been done than I'm aware of. So I recognize those limitations before I want to recognize those limitations before I start. And I'm going to give a very simple talk. I want to show you the outline. This is what I'm going to talk about today. Where have we come from? What do we need to know? Why should we do it? And then to talk about our experience in building the Comparative Agendas project, what it means and the difficulties and the opportunities of it, and then to provide some thoughts about what we might do moving forward. I also want to recognize a number of people from the Comparative Agendas project are here today from a number of countries, and I want to thank you for your efforts and contributions. And I also should mention a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about was really a collaboration between my long-standing collaborator, Brian Jones, who's at the University of Texas, but also with really an expanding group of dozens, scores, and now over 100 people in 25 countries. So it's not, I don't want to take credit. That's not due. But I would like to remember or remind you or let you know about where comparative public policy was when I started in the profession, and many of you will find this familiar. Some of you might not be familiar with it, but I also want to distinguish between styles of research that are common in political science and to recognize the tendency that most of us have in most subfields of political science to work on our own as lone scholars, individual scholars. But I want to point to a few counterexamples. I would say that, and this has been true my entire career, I studied at the University of Michigan, and my professors at the time who studied voting and elections did not work alone. They worked in very large teams, and they required massive amounts of money to conduct the national surveys that they relied on for their research. So it was a very different model than the other model, which was the scholar working in their office by themselves. Those large teams of voting and attitude, public attitude scholars worked also in collaboration with friends and collaborators overseas, and they developed very large and fruitful collaborations. And the key item that I noticed at the time, back in the 1970s and 80s, was that they shared data infrastructure. They combined their efforts to write surveys, questions, and to get them administered and raise the funds to do very large-scale research. And the key element was to do the same research in many countries. And a key element of doing that type of research was not to go off on your own. You had to do it in a way that was comparable to how it was being done somewhere else. And within political science, voting studies have always had that characteristic. That's not the only characteristic, but also I would note people that study trade rely on the same databases. People that study exchange rates, trade, international political economy use very similar databases. The entire profession of economics relies on very detailed databases representing the state of the economy, whether it's a national economy or international comparisons of economic outputs. My colleagues who study the generation of war rely on shared databases associated with economic outputs of countries and the odds or the actual observed facts of whether or not country A happens to be at war with country B at any given time. And the Correlates of War project was also something that I grew up with in graduate school, and it represented something that was really quite distinct from another model, which also has fantastic positive elements, which is the single scholar working alone. But I want to focus on some elements of that single scholar model that I learned in graduate school. And that was, first of all, that each scholar had their country. My country was France. And I was supposed to learn everything about it. All the rivers, the mountain ranges, everything France, that was what I studied in graduate school. And so in order to have your bona fides as a comparativist, you needed to know your country. And certainly there's nothing wrong with knowing what you study. It's a great idea. To all the grad students, I certainly recommend it. But I noticed also that when, especially my colleagues that studied authoritarian dictatorships, when their country had a transition, all of a sudden they were experts on transitions to democracy. And when that country started to, or began to, or in a faltering kind of way, started to consolidate that democracy, that scholar who was previously an expert on authoritarian dictatorships became an expert on something else. And so that focus on a country, as valuable as it may be, came at a cost. And the cost was a sort of utility infielder attitude towards theoretical questions and substantive questions, because the substantive questions of interest associated with any given country might change over time. Right now, American politics is all about polarization and popular resentment, but it didn't used to be. Okay? So one element of this is that we study, quote unquote, my country. The second element in public policy is we study my policy. We become experts on immigration, energy, shale gas, wind, education, pedagogy, higher education reform, pensions and Social Security, or some element of healthcare, etc., or nuclear nonproliferation, strategic deterrence. And most of our colleagues, most of us as public policy scholars, spend our entire careers honing our expertise on a particular domain of public policy. And it's hard work. I've chosen in my career not to do that, and it's been extremely difficult to get up to speed when I've wanted to, for example, write a book about policing and traffic stops. I'd never read a book about how police function before, about 10 years ago. And I had never read a book about the death penalty before I decided to write a book about the death penalty. It takes a lot of work to learn the vocabulary and to understand the substance, the subject matter of your subject matter. So not only do we pick our country, but we pick our policy on average. And just like picking our country, knowing everything there is to know about the history and development of the U.S. Social Security Administration is a fantastic thing to do. I highly recommend it. It's really the way to learn about how governments do things, to do it in some detail. Another thing we've always done is we pick a time period. And the time period usually happens to be right now. And we consider that to be theoretically relevant because it's right now. But you know, right now was 1984 when I did my first book, and it's not 1984 anymore. And in retrospect, the only reason why I picked that particular period was that was when I happened to get my grant to go to France to interview bureaucrats. So there's nothing special about the time period in which I did my research. And there's nothing special about the country that I chose, although I liked it. There's nothing special about the policy domain that I picked. The last thing I want to mention about the traditional focus on how we do research is we write our book. So we have our country, our policy, our time frame, and our book. The book can't be a replication of somebody else's book. It'll never get published. So we have to revise any existing theories and show some wrinkles, some inadequacies, and demonstrate something new about our theoretical perspective. Beth Leach and I one time wrote a book, 1998, reviewing the literature on the subject of interest groups and their mobilization and their efforts to influence public policy in the United States. And we describe the development of the literature as that of one case study at a time. And the puzzle that we had was why this literature did not accumulate. It grew, but it didn't accumulate. The reason why it grew, but didn't accumulate theoretically and in terms of knowledge, was that nobody could publish anything that merely replicated the work of someone that had come before them. And this is an issue across the social sciences. It means that we each have to, quote unquote, innovate. But by innovating, we're generating a case study that cannot be compared to any previous case study that's ever been done. Because that's the entire point. We have to be unique. We have to show our skills as individual scholars, our creativity, and our intellectual contribution. I think these are problems. They're characteristics of a traditional way of doing research. But this concept that we have our country, our policy domain, our time period, and our theory really hinders the development of a cumulative scientific enterprise. What do we need to know? I think we need to decide collectively, and I don't propose to suggest what the answer is, but we need to decide collectively what are the big theoretical questions to which we collectively need answers. My focus has been on understanding governments as units that attempt to solve problems. Complex organizations that seek to improve life. Now, the definition of improved life could be open to interpretation. But common questions are, how do governments focus their attention? Do they in fact solve problems? Which problems do they solve? Do they make life better or worse for their populations? And if so, how? How do they set their priorities? Who participates? Who has influence? There are some basic questions that any of us should be or could be interested in across various governments. Let me mention two that I focus on, and I'll get to this research infrastructure in just a second. One of the most important things I think that governments do is respond to things that they don't control. I think about my experience in following the activities of the U.S. federal government. Well, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, in an area of huge racial strife and dramatic industrial decline. So it did surprise me when the U.S. government decided to purchase the General Motors Corporation, which had been the largest corporation in the world in the 1950s, and it's based in my hometown. So in 2007, Republican President George W. Bush purchased General Motors on behalf of the U.S. taxpayers, avoiding massive bankruptcy and fallout from the financial collapse. It was quite a surprise, because I remember the Republican Party in the United States doesn't typically stand for nationalizing major industries. And I also remember our research in Agendas and Instability, which was published in the 1990s. We focused on the rise of the environmental movement and its impact on the nuclear power industry. And one of the things that struck us, Brian Jones and myself, what struck us in that research was how many pieces of landmark environmental legislation were passed under the presidency of Richard Nixon, creating the Environmental Protection Agency, etc. I mention these two examples just to say that collectively in political science, at least in American political science, and in Western European research, we tend to assert or think that or approach the question of government priorities based on a top-down model of what the Prime Minister would actually like to accomplish. The Prime Minister or the President of any democratically elected government certainly comes into office with some preferences. But I can guarantee you that George W. Bush did not come into office with the plan to purchase General Motors. But in the very last days of his presidency, that's exactly what he did. And he didn't do it because he wanted to. He did it because he felt, and his advisors felt, that he had to. So the difference between a proactive self-agenda setting process based on ideological preference of the parties in power and a more reactive vision of government as a set of leaders who are attempting to cope with a set of changing circumstances that they may not control and they may not like, is a really different way of thinking about government. And that's the way I think about governments everywhere. The other thing that struck me in the early years of my career was that if we have a really strongly deductive theoretical focus, that's fantastic to test certain small questions. But if our theory is so tight and clear, we better hope it's a good theory. And we better hope that it can be applied to a narrow question that can be addressed on its own without implications more broadly. I'm reminded simply of the idea of looking under the streetlight for your lost keys. If that's the only place where you look, that's the only place where you might find anything. Okay? And from that, my response was, let's look at everything. Let's make some databases that allow us to not be restricted in our empirical reach, that allow us to look at the entire range of activities of a government and see what's there. And let's see how many of these activities could be predicted based on the ideological preferences of the party in power, or the re-election preferences, or any other potential theory. Let's just get the stupid data. Just get the data. Let the data tell us. I don't have a theory about what the government should do. I have some observations about what the government does. And that's going to allow me to make some tests, develop some theories, and to puzzle through the question of why the government does what it does. But we can't start with a theory, a strict, narrow theory, and expect to understand the full range of government activities. The last thing I want to mention before I get into the infrastructure is a conversation between two titans of political science back in the 1950s and 60s. Warren Miller, who was one of my professors at the University of Michigan, who was one of the greatest entrepreneurs of American political science, generating the financial support for the National Election Studies. And Warren, like most of my professors at Michigan, was interested in public attitudes. He was interested in voters. And E.E. Schatzschneider, whom I never met, but I wish I had because I love his work so much, we're at a conference at APSA on a panel. And Schatzschneider said to Warren Miller, "Warren, why do you study the audience when all the action's up on stage?" And I think that it's a lesson that we all need to learn, and I don't think I have to teach people here at a conference on public policy about the importance of studying public policy actors rather than voters. Nothing wrong with studying voters, okay? But that's not our thing. Our thing is to study government officials, people in and around government, and find out what makes them tick, what makes them do what they do, and then our data set is based on at least showing what they do. Then it's a question, why do they do it? Let me explain a little bit about my experience with many others in building an infrastructure project. Brian Jones and I wrote a book in 1993 in which we documented, or we discovered that it was very useful to know just a little bit about a public policy, but to track that small bit of information across many years of data, across over a generation, maybe 50 years, rather than the more typical fieldwork-based pinprick of a time perspective, maybe a few years time perspective, maybe 1 year time perspective, but we could use indicators from printed resources such as media and government indicators to track attention to an issue over, say, 50 years. And then we also found that we could replicate such studies across a number of policies relatively quickly. So the trade-off that we made was we said, we don't want to write the definitive book about the development of the nuclear industry in the United States. We want to make a quick but reliable tracking of how nuclear energy was portrayed in the American government from 1940 to the publication date of our book, around 1990. And then let's do it again for pesticides. Then let's do it again for child abuse. And let's do it again for smoking and tobacco. And let's multiply these examples so that for once, we could not have my country, my time period, my public policy, but we would have, well, we still had my country because it was based on a single country, but we had a multiplication of policy illustrations, and we had a very long time perspective, entire post-World War II period. We found that that was actually quite useful, and the data that we collected, while very much just skimming of the surface of the details that somebody else might have done, and other people had previously, in fact, done, we found it to be very effective, very useful. And it was fast, and we could train students to help us do it. So we put in a proposal to the National Science Foundation the year after that book was published to create a database of, for example, every hearing that the US Congress has held since World War II. And then another database of every law that had been passed, and a database of all executive orders by the president and other relevant databases, all based on easily available, although at the time, print government documents. And this was rejected on the basis of being impossible. So we worked on it anyway for another year, and we kept careful track of how long it actually did take to train students and to gather the data for a subset of what we wanted to do. And then we proved them wrong. We proved them to their satisfaction, so that in the following round of submissions, we were able to resubmit with some validation of our estimates of cost and feasibility. And we got some funding in order to create the U.S. Policy Agendas Project. That was 1994. And this project then took several years, but we generated some interesting databases, entire records of the entire post-war history of the activities of the U.S. government across all domains, not in any particular domain, but every congressional hearing, every law. Later we added every bill introduced, and other databases that continue to be added. We were lucky enough that we had a colleague come visit from Denmark. He came to visit the University of Washington, where Brian Jones was teaching, and he had previously taken one of my seminars actually in Norway when I was a visiting professor. And Christopher Green Peterson from Aarhus University then said, you know, I think I could do that for Denmark. I can get some money and do it for Denmark. And so he did, he made a database. And the surprising thing was, the key thing in our database is that we have a classification structure that allows us to classify every action of the US government. And when so for example, there's 250 codes, roughly speaking, that identify everything from paying attention to the unemployment rate to endangered species protection to building wells and distributing water, making sure water is safe to drink, and engaging in nuclear warfare and paying the pensions of widows of soldiers, everything. And when Christopher went to do this in Denmark, he found a few things that they do that we don't do. For example, they have an official state religion. And the United States doesn't ever hold congressional hearings on appointing bishops to the state religion. Well, they do that in Denmark, and so we had to make a few new codes. And, but But for the most part, he was pleasantly surprised and quite surprised that the topic classification system that worked in the United States it overlapped about 90% in Denmark. And then we found another colleague, Stefan Walgrave, who had already had a grant to build a database where he was studying the impact of protests, social movement protests in Belgium. And he had done much of this very similar work to what we had done, but he had made up his own, what I describe as a cockamamie scheme to classify the subjects. So he recoded all of his data into our comparative classification system, and he found that it was easy to use Christopher's Danish database as a model. And eventually, those two and others then got a pretty large European Science Foundation grant to expand the project to Switzerland, Spain, France, and the United Kingdom. By that time, we really had developed a system that has now become an international classification system where it simply takes any utterance of a prime minister or any bill introduced in Parliament or an oral question in Parliament or any activity by the government, and it classifies it so that we know how many activities focus on immigration versus energy supply versus endangered species protection. And the interesting thing about this infrastructure is that it so happens that governments everywhere have to, hire teachers. And they have to certify people to operate in certain professions. They have to build highways. They have to worry about air quality. They have to worry about water quality. They have to allocate fishing resources. They do the same things. Now, some of them do other things. Some of them do things that are unique to their own context, but for the most part, there's a common set, very large set, but a common set of activities. By producing this database and making it easily available to anyone online, we did a number of things. We subsidized, and this is our goal in the project, is to subsidize other people's research. We do half the work for you. As a matter of fact, in some cases, we do about 98% of the work for you. Okay? But the key is that we don't want people to be able to go back to the old system to saying my country, because we have 25 countries in the system. If you can't find a country of interest and compare it to the other 24, that's your fault. Okay? We want to subsidize and make it possible, make it easy, make it simple to expand the scope of political science and public policy research. So we expand by country, we expand by policy domain. There's no reason to do a research project only about immigration if you could just as easily do it about 25 or 50 different policy topics with the click of a button, a click of a mouse. We also want to subsidize people's research into longer time periods, because there is no time period that's quote-unquote typical. Politics is dynamic. It changes strongly over time. So we want to subsidize our efforts, our collective efforts, to study and analyze much longer time periods than are typically done, certainly is typical on fieldwork-based research projects. And then we want to get away from the my book model. We want to encourage people to write books as parts of teams and to write collective research projects as parts of teams. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the dangers of that in a minute. But I want to explain a couple things that our project does not do. It doesn't impose a theoretical perspective. It's completely neutral with regards to how one might analyze the data. It simply provides a database about what governments actually do, usually over very long periods of time. It doesn't write the book for you. It doesn't do any of the analysis. It just provides the data. And it doesn't provide everything that a scholar might want. but it provides a platform. And it provides a platform that would allow anybody to start a research project that maybe perhaps needs to be completed with the collection of some additional data, but that's your problem, okay? And it would make it easy to do that. So then what it does is allow a different kind of research that does not rely on my country, my policy, my time period, my theory. It allows collaborators to work on the basis of shared databases. And most importantly, I think, it allows antagonists and theoretically hostile individuals to work on the basis of the same data. Because we don't embargo anything. We make everything available freely. So people who disagree with any published research findings can go get the data and analyze it in some different way, okay? So rather than suggest that there is no answer to a theoretical dispute in the literature, if we share our data resources and make them freely available, the theoretical disputes can really be addressed, okay? Hopefully not leading to simply a dead end. And then the last thing that we really try to do is promote complete opening and transparency. I do want to mention one drawback, one challenge of this, and that is evaluating the individual contribution of scholars. It's hard at tenure time, it's hard at promotion time to look at a scholar whose research record consists of collaborations with large international teams. It's difficult to understand what's exactly their individual contribution. And to that I just say, who cares? Who cares, really? Think about the chemistry profession. They don't do that. Think about astronomy. They don't do that. There's no astronomer since Galileo who was a one-man operation, okay? They just don't work that way. So if other professions have figured it out, then it's on us and it's on our academic administrators to understand that the profession will be better off if we abandon or at least move away from or accept an alternative to the traditional lone scholar model. And the alternative is teams of people working on common research problems, contributing to the collective effort by data collection and sharing those data freely, and then drawing from the collective effort by using the infrastructure that other people have used so that they can put their special interest, their country, their policy, their time period in automatic comparison with other countries through databases that have been collected by other people, maybe a generation ago, okay? Because our data now have been in constant development since 1994. Okay? So it's getting on. I guess we should have a bar mitzvah for our database. Now, let me just say a few things about moving forward, the big challenges and opportunities. And I want to say just two things here, really. With regards to the Comparative Agendas project, there's huge opportunities associated with big data and the availability of computer-based resources. Governments document themselves very well. As a matter of fact, typically the problem of government documentation is that there's too much information for us to handle, but with collaborations with computer scientists and really understanding the value of big data, I think we can really gain a lot, at least for the contemporary period moving forward. It's also quite possible that historical archivists are going to find this classification system a very useful way to understand the previous histories as they digitize historical records. And so I'm actually very hopeful about the opportunities for digitization of historical records and also understanding in real time the development of policy process over time across many countries. I'd say that another massive opportunity for us, which has so far gone unmet, unrealized is a more fruitful collaboration between qualitative scholars and quantitative scholars. Because our project focuses on gathering data, and because some of the initial projects that we developed had a highly quantitative flavor, our project has unfortunately become associated with a purely quantitative methodology. Nothing could be further from the initial goals of our project. And as a matter of fact, when I thought about the development of this project, my first thought was we could facilitate and subsidize the development of qualitative historical treatments of individual policy domains. Because through our database, if somebody was interested in every policy activity related to topic X, whatever that topic might be, with a few mouse clicks, they can download and identify every government activity in that country since for the period of our databases, and then go read it. Go do whatever qualitative work you want. Maybe 5 people would collaborate and each become an expert on the personalities and the foibles and the reasons and the development of these policy changes over time in great detail using qualitative assessments of the original source documents, interviews, or whatever. That has hardly ever happened, and I really don't understand why, because it is perhaps simply a disciplinary thing, but anyway, our databases do allow what amounts to a sophisticated index of government documents. And that sophisticated index of many government documents across many countries and across huge time periods would seem to be a natural for somebody who wants to write a policy history. But I think the promise of data infrastructure is not really, I don't want to focus just on the Comparative Agendas project. There's many other projects. Party Manifesto project, the entire profession of economics deals with economic data gathered in a comparable manner across many countries. And I think that it's up to us as scholars simply to develop these research infrastructures so that we use shared resources that many scholars working independently will have at least a common baseline for analysis. And that will move the study of public policy forward in a way like nothing else has in the past. Those are my comments. I open the floor for questions.
So anyone who has questions, I think the mics are coming up. At least one is on the right hand, at least my right hand side. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Or have we gotten anything by Twitter? There we go, thanks.
Hi, I'm Leanne Giordano. I'm from Oregon State University. And my question is really whether there's been any discussion about taking the Comparative Agendas project down to the sub-national level, so the state level or the provincial level.
Well, the answer is yes. There's a project for the state of Pennsylvania that's fully developed. There's a project in development for the state of Florida in the United States. Peter Mortensen in Denmark has coded agendas of all the Danish municipalities over some long period of time. There's a National Science Foundation project sort of in the beginning stages to attempt to develop a 50-state database. At least that would provide a core of information about laws and bills. And so my idea on the Agendas project is we should have it for every government entity that we can find. And that includes international organizations. There's a project for the European Union. but of course, all it requires is the value of the Agendas project for the individual scholar is that if you develop a new database on a new political entity, whether it's a new country or a municipality, and you follow the classification system, then automatically you've got a database that can be compared so that you can understand how your political entity compares with all those that are already in the system. So we're finding now that people simply show up at our annual meeting, or they write to us and say, you know, I'd like to do this for Venezuela, or I'd like to do this for country X or for political system Y. And all it takes is attention to detail and a lot of work. But the value is that the database that you create, it's the same amount of work as if you created it to stand on its own. It actually automatically fits into a growing international infrastructure that facilitates comparisons.
Sorry, I'm already holding a microphone, so if I can take the opportunity while someone's walking. My name is Brooke Struck. I'm from the Decision Lab here in Montreal. And the question that worries me in all of this is how much we should be concerned about this classification sort of representing a temporal snapshot of the state of government and the way that problems are cut apart. So for instance, if we look at the classification of research into different areas, we see that classifications that were created 30 years ago have trouble accommodating things like nanotechnology that cut across transversal boundaries. And my own background is in philosophy, and so my temporal perspective is very different than a lot of scientists. And you know, when we start talking about what the roots of science are in these classification systems applied to really, really old research before the term scientist was even coined, we start to see how awkward those tensions can be. And I wonder how much this kind of classification system would run into the same kind of challenge. So would we be doing some violence to, for instance, the government of ancient Byzantium to try to apply our current classification to their activities? And with the pace of change accelerating, will we be doing violence to the government of even 75 or 100 years from now by thinking that the current classification that we have for our problem topography is going to map well onto the challenges that governments will face in 50 years, 75 years, 100 years?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thank you for that. Let me say several things about that. The first is that you've identified something that we take very seriously, but which is an inevitable problem. And I think I could give several examples. The first is how we tried to improve on the status quo. A status quo situation in government is librarians and archivists seeking to identify documents by any topic that anyone might ever want to find. So they use keywords, and they multiply keywords, and they add new ones without going back to retrofit their databases to add those same keywords to older documents because they do everything in real time. So as we were first developing our coding system, empirically we worked backwards in time. And we found occasionally that there were topics that had disappeared. So for us, they were new topics, and we had to reclassify sometimes our coding system until it calibrated and that we found that we were no longer doing so. But every once in a while, we've come across a database that allowed some new things. For example, when we went to state governments, with the case of Pennsylvania, state governments in the United States do a lot of things that the US federal government does not do. For example, they regulate barbershops, and they regulate professions. The federal government in the United States just doesn't do that. So we had to develop a number of new classifiers. And the key thing is that once we developed those classifications, we had to then go back to all the existing databases and make sure that they were coded appropriately. We did run into the opportunity to code the budget of the country of Malta for a long period of time. And it was in a period of democracy, and it was in a period of British colonial rule, and it was in a period of the Knights of Malta in the 1400s. We found some budget data from the 1400s. And it turns out that they had categories for slave redemption. And that's buying yourself out of slavery. So I had to look that up. I didn't know what that was. And so that's an example of, I think, exactly what you're talking about. And I just have to say that it's a problem, and it's a problem that we try to solve by making sure that when we encounter a new topic, we retrofit all the existing databases to make sure that they all include that topic. But it's an empirical problem, and you're right to point to the issue.
Okay, thank you. I'd like first of all to thank you very much for the bright expose. So I'm very interested in the 25 countries you are working with. And as you know, the data integrity is my question. Gathering that information from the countries that are open versus the countries that are not necessarily cooperating or have interest in hiding certain things. How do you go about that and making sure that the integrity of the data you're having is valuable? Because I think it's crucial when we are dealing with a country, some of these authoritarian countries versus working in a country that's free, where people, that data is very accessible and the quality is not compromised.
The databases rely on the availability of government documents. And if the government documents aren't available, then we can't do the project. So, we don't try to pretend that we have a way to create transparency where the government has destroyed documents or kept things secret. I would say that going back in time, I do hope that we will be able to generate databases on a number of countries. We have a number of Eastern European countries in our system where the databases do go back to the period of communist rule. And I'm quite certain that some documents under, Soviet-style communism were suppressed. But I also know that bureaucrats keep records. And if we find the right records, we'll be surprised. And they might hide certain facts, but if they're working on a topic that relates to energy production, there might not be any reason to hide the fact that they had some law or some budget category that related to energy production or building a dam or whatever the topic. Every topic that governments do is not necessarily prone to confidentiality concerns, although certainly some are. And so, I wouldn't recommend this approach, which relies on official documents for all policy, for all areas of study. We have to recognize what it is. It's based on government documents. If the government documents aren't available, we can't do the project.
Thanks very much. I'm Greg Marnie from the University of Canberra. My question comes from myself as an economist, and I was pleased to hear that you were raising the point that economists have this common data set. But there's a bit of a conflict, I think, in that where your collection of data is apparently sort of atheoretical. Economists only have a broad set of data really from the 1930s onwards after Keynes. And that data was developed with the national accounts and then the international accounts after World War II under the auspices of the UN. And it was based on data for flows and stocks. And that sort of theoretical conception of unpicking the distinction between a flow and a stock, flows of income and expenditure, C plus I plus G plus X minus M that you probably learned as an undergraduate, those things fitted exactly into the national accounts under Sir Richard Stone from Cambridge, and he got the Nobel Prize for it. So even though most economists won't admit it, there is a deeply theoretical, or at least a conceptual, basis for all that broad data. And yes, it varies at the margin about unemployment. There are problems of accounting for non-marketed outputs and production in a developing economy, like say Papua New Guinea has about a third of their national accounts which has to be imputed because people don't sort of market the goods yet. So it seems to me that while your aspirations are admirable to have a sort of theory-free body of data, there's oftentimes a sort of a body of concepts and theories underpinning what we collect. That was my only real observation. And the other thing, I'm not quite sure, I'd have to go and have a look at it again, but when I worked around the UN in the 1980s, they had a problem of too much paper. And this was only just before the invention of the internet, of course, and things. So they were really worried about how to store all the data in New York, you know, all of the paper that the committees, and they had a whole series of codes for the different committees. And I just wondered if you'd ever looked at that sort of coding system. It was fairly sort of high-level codes for environment committees and other things, and whether they addressed that question of how to codify their discussions in a way of what was discussed at the UN. So that's a second question, actually.
On the first item, I think that to the extent that there is something, it's an orientation that suggests that visible activities or documented activities are of interest. And so there's a lot of things that we can't study, which is things that have not been documented, such as somebody's motivation. We don't know that. And so I think to that extent, I do want to recognize that we are engaging in obviously a very empirical effort that by its very empiricism incorporates a certain perspective. But that's the limit of it as far as I can tell, or at least that's our goal. We're not trying to impose anything beyond that. If the Prime Minister gives a speech, we code each sentence. And we say, was that sentence about immigration, or was that sentence about unemployment compensation, or the congratulating the national soccer team? That's all we do, just know what was it about, what was the topic. So it's not really now the topic system itself inevitably is subjective and subject to criticism, but I think we did a pretty good job of being as neutral as possible, but that it's a human endeavor. So, and to that extent, yeah, it's not, it could never be, it is what it is, and it could never be, nothing of its type could be entirely neutral, but it is as neutral as we could make it. I haven't personally looked at the United Nations documents, but I would say that many governments have pretty sophisticated subject classification systems, and to the extent that we can create a crosswalk between those previously existing classification systems and our system, then we can do this work wholesale. Simply recode the existing documents into our system, which I think could be very valuable. Because once it's in this system, it's comparable across many other, or to many other databases.
So, Anna Dornova, Charles University, Prague. Frank, I want to come back onto your larger proposal that was very thought-provoking, and I want to thank you for that. In your statement, you emphasized that a good public policy research needs to be comparative and needs to be comparative on a level of diversified experiences and needs to be collaborative. And I think this was a very thought-provoking proposal. And you also mentioned the advices that you would sort of give to policy scholars how they should do that they should sort of not care about these times that are actually not really praising these collaboration. And I heard that proposal. At the same time, I want to push you a bit more on that, because it seems like, to paraphrase your earlier quote, that you are advising the audience, and among policy scholars, I don't think that there are negative attitudes towards collaborations, and I don't even think that there are negative attitudes towards collaboration between qualitative and quantitative researchers. I found that part extremely helpful and extremely important that you emphasize that. What about the stage? What can public policy research do to change the stage of scientific policies? Because scientific policies, as you mentioned yourself, are praising scientific excellence based on competition, not on collaboration. So what can we do as public policy researchers in order to change that stage? And my minor question to that would be, since you mentioned the collaboration between quantitative and qualitative, what were your experiences, or what are the lessons learned from experiences in collaborating with qualitative researchers that you would share with us? Thank you.
Okay, let me ask for a clarification on the question about what can we do about the state of science?
No, I mean, what can we do about because the policies, and I think that I make this bold statement that I think it's all over in the Western democratic systems. Science policies are not really based on collaborations in the sense that they would, for instance, like with science policies, I mean, the career policies for scientists are not based on collaboration primarily. They're based on competition, they're based on scientific excellence, and although I completely share your advice to do a good comparative public policy research along collaboration, I see many limits in practicing that on an everyday basis for us researchers, especially those who are not tenured. And I heard your proposal that we should just not care about it and do it anyway because all we care about is a good public policy research, and I second that. However, we are within a stage. We need money, we need a tenure, we need so that, like, how do you change the stage? The one that is giving us these limitations.
My comment about the need to change the way that we evaluate individual scholars is exactly based on this thing that I think you understand correctly. I'm really talking to research administrators and senior scholars, and not to junior scholars. The junior scholars are in the system where it's important to establish one's individual identity and one's accomplishments. So I think that to the junior scholar, I have to say, do some of each. You have to establish some individual accomplishment, but I think in the long run, collaborating and learning through a large team is going to be helpful. But to the senior scholars and to those of us who might have access to university administrators and journal editors and people who are in positions of institutional power, I think we just have to say to them that this is not collectively helpful. It's not conducive of the highest quality science. It's creating a collective action dilemma that's generating the old model, my country, my policy, my book, rather than a model that's more similar to how it works in other scientific disciplines. And to the extent that people say, well, how could we possibly do that? I would just say, well, somehow they manage in physics. Somehow they do it in other disciplines. So I don't have the solution, but I'll just take credit for amplifying the problem. But it's a problem. So it's a serious problem. There was another part to your question, or a second question, which was working with collaborating with qualitative scholars. And I like to think of myself as some of each. And let me give an example of something that Brian Jones and I did in our 1993 book, which was really have a substantial focus on policy framing, how policies were framed in a partial manner, selective emphasis on a particular element of the policy. And so we were very oriented towards developing measures of frames. And also we were quite interested in measuring partisan directionality of government activities. For example, if a government is discussing unemployment compensation, are they trying to expand the program or restrict the program? The directionality of the activity is of interest. And we decided, much to our dismay, that it was not feasible for us to incorporate systematic analysis of directionality of the activity or frame analysis. Not because we weren't interested in doing so, but because it's just you need too much information, it's too detailed. You have to understand the policy more than is possible if you're gonna have a database of the scope of what we try to do. So we didn't do it. We don't build that in. So anybody that wants to study partisan directionality of public policy really needs to add it themselves. Similarly, as I've done many times in various projects, study framing in some detail. You can't do it off the shelf with the Policy Agendas project. You have to add a deep understanding of the development of the policy and the frames associated with it over time by more detailed analysis. So it's just a simple example.
Thank you. I'm Lei Shi from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So I basically have two questions. First of all, have you and your team ever encountered a thing like you want to comprise a database of agenda and so forth, and maybe some similar database have also existed? For example, I browsed and see you have a database center in European Union, and I know that some, for example, European Union media, they also have their perhaps more private access database about tracking commission presidents and key personnels, and also the commission files and so forth. So regarding this existence of databases, do you find these to be helpful, or you simply discard them? You would rather choose to discard these and try to apply your own methodology and collect data overall from scratch again, because this may have some trade-offs here.
The general logic is, it's decentralized, but if there's a database that's comprehensive and can be recoded, we would certainly use it. But if there's a database that is selective in any way, shape, or form, and it only involves a small subset of the government documents because they're more interesting, or we wouldn't use that. We would only use something that's comprehensive.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Eve Hadzopoulou from Roskilde University in Denmark. And you mentioned many times Denmark, and I feel very nice about this, but on the other hand, Denmark has a very strong public administration system and data registration. So how could we use all this experience by what you have done up to now to really push countries like my home country, Greece, where we don't have parallel systems? And what do we learn from this as researchers, and how can we use this in the future? For example, the ministries in Greece, they don't even have annual reports, and I try to do comparative study between Greece and Denmark. So this is one question. The second part is how all this work contributes to understanding and develop generalizations mainly on the westernized world, and how problematic can be if we actually want to study countries that are not westernized using generalizations we developed from this data. And the third one, to what extent you're considering to do a parallel data collection on international public administrations, which become very important, and we are developing a lot of studies more and more. Thank you.
So let me try to remember. So the first question is, what do we do with a country that doesn't keep good documentation? And I think public transparency is just something that has to be forced on government officials sometimes. And so to the extent that our project can have an impact on that, which I think is very minor. We study the governments, we don't tell them what to do. We're not a lobbying organization. But to the extent that it's possible to document that there's an international norm of transparency, at least for certain basic items of government activity, and then we can document that such things exist across a wide range of countries, then I think there is a shaming element that could potentially have some positive impact. The second question about the cultural bias is, it's a very important question, and I would just say that our research project is open to all comers, and we would love to have a wider range. of systems included in the project. We have had a very European focus, very Western European focus. Recently, we've expanded into Central and to some extent Eastern Europe. We have currently a number of projects developing in Latin America. There's been several in China and in East Asia, Korea and Japan. And I hope that it will continue to grow. And I think that the only way to avoid the bias is to develop more projects. And my hope is that by expanding the number of countries and the range of types of countries, we can address some questions that have never really been assessed before, which is like, does the form of government affect the topics of activity? We really don't know that much about what governments do. We know about what government leaders say, we might know about rates of poverty, but we really don't have any empirical assessment about the actual activities or areas, relative prioritization of different areas of public policy. To me, that's an empirical question. I hope that such data would be available for a wide range of countries, but I recognize every country doesn't keep as good records as every other country, and we are limited by that. You had then about international organizations, same idea. We would love to see this applied to the World Trade Association, to the United Nations. It has been done for the European Union, but there's no reason why it should be limited to nation states.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. It's a Muslim greeting. It means, it's a Muslim greeting. My name is Binish, which is kosher. I come from Kashmir. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
But just kosher, I come from Kashmir. I'm a displaced indigenous woman. I want to express my gratitude to my relations, indigenous relations, to the Kani and Kehaka Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Abenaki, and the Anishinaabe Algonquin people whose unceded land we're here meeting on today. My question for the presenter relates to the promotion of sharing free data and sharing it without hesitation, and also closely to this idea that we should do collaborations and we should do them without thinking about who has done what. I'm really uncomfortable by those two particular suggestions, though I also see the value in it. Like, I welcome it as I think it's really important to learn from each other and to co-create knowledges. But I also worry about the reproduction of violent colonial problematics, such as epistemic erasures, of physical erasures, of genocidal erasures, when those kind of collaborations happen, particularly when there's this assumption that there's a sense of neutrality that can be had in doing knowledge production, which seems to be much of what positivist policy research tends to do. So I'm grappling with those tensions, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. How do you navigate doing knowledge production situated where you are in your location with different epistemic communities, with different value systems that may not want to give access, and if they give access, it means a certain kind of responsibility to carry that knowledge in a good way.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question. I could tell you that coming from where I am situated, I'm very aware of that, and I don't do research on populations that I think are vulnerable. This is research about government officials, and so they're not vulnerable, they're people in power, and these are governments. And so I feel like it is useful to everybody to understand what our governments do, whether we like the governments, whether we like the policies they're enacting, or whether we dislike them. It's useful to know what they do. The project is not one where we attempt to gather information about other types of actors, social movement actors, individual people. It's government ministers giving speeches. And I think that's almost a definition of not a vulnerable individual.
If I may just add
Yeah.
to clarify my comment. Sorry, I'm
Yeah.
over here. Just if I could clarify. So, Six Nations, for example, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is an indigenous government, and it's near the Great Lakes region. That is not a marginalized policy actor, that's a government. And there are collaborative research projects that are done that tend to sort of emulate this sense of neutrality, as if we can go and study their policy decisions, their government's actions. I'm wondering whether you can speak to the ethics that are required when doing those kind of research studies that still involve government decision makers, but those government decision makers are still situated within the framework of global power imbalances and policy histories that have reproduced certain kinds of violences.
Well, I guess all I can really say about that is that we haven't faced the issue. You know, we started studying the United States government based on printed official documents available, you know, in the Library of Congress and elsewhere, and then it was expanded to certain other governments. And so I think it might be useful, but we haven't addressed the question of populations of the type that you're describing. So I really, since we haven't addressed it, I can't tell you the answer. And I wouldn't personally be the person to make the answer. It would be whoever it was that wanted to conduct that study. So I appreciate the question, but I really don't have an answer to it because we haven't faced it.
As scarcity and competition as mechanisms for encouraging individual researchers to conduct research independently rather than in groups. But if we can put aside those motivations for a moment and focus on just the impact of group sharing of group research done following encouragement or requirement of following particular practices or working together in some way, do you see this as having any potential impact on the autonomy of individual researchers and their capacity to make claims or research or pursue research directions that might be considered politically dangerous in the context of their research groups?
When you say politically dangerous, do you mean like that they could go to jail? It's a sensitive...
No. I just mean what are the impacts? Have you considered the impacts of requiring or encouraging people to work together and the group dynamics that result in pressure to do or not do certain things, or do or pursue or not pursue certain lines of research?
Yeah, I feel like that's a good question, and nobody has to do this. You know, I mean, the vast majority of us work on our own, or we work with a single collaborator, or we work on a particular research project that we choose to develop for whatever reasons we might choose. And there's nothing in anything that I've done that would inhibit anybody from doing exactly that and continuing on as they've done in the past. Our point is not that we would require somebody to participate in a collaboration. That's certainly not possible in any case. Our point is just what I said, that I think that the profession collectively will benefit from some shared effort. Putting our shoulder to the same wheel, pushing in the same direction is helpful. Now, it doesn't mean that in addition to the common publication or research questions or projects that we might do on a team, we wouldn't also work on our own on some offshoot of the project. And certainly if the database doesn't lend itself to the question that's of interest to the individual scholar, there's no reason why they need to use it. So it's entirely a voluntary thing. It's not, there's no sanctions, there's no coercion, there's no requirements. And I know that if there's 12,000 members of the American Political Science Association, not to speak of the rest of the world, you know, we don't control that. It's entirely voluntary. And we don't expect to become a juggernaut to control the future of research with some top-down system. That's not even in my dreams.
Actually, I want to ask a follow-up question about that. I'm just thinking out loud, maybe we should brainstorm about this together as people who works on government institutions. Before I went to my fieldwork in France and Turkey, my institution wanted me to submit approval letters from the ministries in both countries so that I could start my research. And I was on a conditional approval for a while, and I couldn't get a full approval because I was just trying to network in the ministries. And I went to Turkey 2 weeks after the attempted coup in 2016, and I had to submit an approval letter. I finally managed to do that in both countries. Getting an approval letter in France was definitely easier than getting it in Turkey at the time. When I spoke to the high-rank officials in the ministry, the first thing that they said to me in both cases was that if we give you an approval, it looks like that we're going to take part of in your research, as if it's going to look like as if we're going to approve your results. And what if the results are negative? Then that's the first issue, and they were completely right about that. The second has to do with accidental reveal of confidential information. Of course, the researchers were free to accept the invitation to participate in the research or not, but they're not really trained in giving interviews to students. In that regard, what if they revealed some confidential information and I ended up publishing that? So what can we as academics think about the challenges of doing research and ethical requirements, and what can be done to make students' lives easier while at the same time protecting both the student and the interviewee? What do you think about that? Thank you.
Well, first, that's a very good question. I would say that in the context of our research for the Agendas project, we deal with official government documents or freely published media documents. And so we don't have a privacy concern. If there's a question in Parliament, that's an open document, and so we don't reveal and we don't make databases about secretive or private activities. So I don't think we face this problem. But I would say more generally, many of us studying public policy do go interview people, and we find ourselves privy to what could potentially be embarrassing information. And I don't have a general answer to the question. It's an ethical question that we all have to face, and I think we should have to have an understanding with the people with whom we interact about the conditions under which the data or information that we come across in our research can be made public or not, and under what conditions. My view in general is that we should maximize publicity and transparency, especially if we're relating to democratically elected governments. And governments are acting on behalf of taxpayers, and people have a right to know what's happening. At the same time, there are confidentiality concerns, and so our research project has focused only on those documents that can be made publicly available. But when we get into the issues that you're describing, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to the question. We have to be sensitive to vulnerable populations and vulnerable individuals within bureaucracies and act responsibly, but I don't have a single answer to that.
Here. Nicholas Schmidt from ETH Zurich. I'm here. Hello.
Okay.
Hi,
go ahead.
Nicolas Schmidt from ETH Zurich. So there are a lot of serious and very urgent problems nowadays. So best example being climate change. And so I'm wondering, and maybe you can expand a bit on how comparative research, as you propose it, can kind of help formulate policy recommendations to actors doing policy to kind of solve these problems. And kind of in this way also increase the societal relevance of public policy research.
I don't think that the Comparative Agendas Project will solve the climate change problem. And I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but I mean, it's a theoretical exercise to understand what causes governments of all kinds and over long periods of time to focus their attention on this rather than that. And that's a concern, I think, that's relevant to those of us who want to understand how policies are made. But it's not relevant to choosing the better policy. We don't assess in our project, did it work or not? We assess how much attention did they pay to it. Now, somebody else could come along behind us because we've subsidized them, as I described, and do a research project about which policies work better than others. But that's not part of our project. So I just want to be very clear, and I don't mean to be flippant, as I mentioned. We don't assess whether it worked well. But I think people with the ability to compare how 10 or 20 countries have addressed topic X could more easily answer that question because we give them a platform from which to start. But that's only a platform.
My question is regarding the, I like the data and I like the comparative studies. And using the data, especially if somebody is an empiricist, it's like somebody that has a diabetes and want to eat chocolate, and it could kill you sometimes. So the accuracy of the data is a problematic because the data is generated by policies, and the policy keep continually changing, and you are producing further data. So I'm just thinking about if people look at it as reflection, how accurate the model that we are producing using this such of the data as, because it's a product of the policy itself, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's a good point. The data that we assess are indicators of government actions. And the government actions follow a logic that generates them. They're generated by something that we can't study. And so it's limited to what it is. And it's limited to an assessment of activities. And I think it would be very useful to add, for example, a comparable set of indicators about outcomes. But that would be something that we would need to add to the database because governments don't automatically collect outcomes data in a comparable manner. So, but you're right, there's an endogeneity problem. So, like I said, it doesn't solve all our problems. It just moves, it gives us a platform from which we can, I think, make further progress. I could tell you that related to that and another project that I've been working on, it's related to police traffic stops. If the police don't write down the traffic stop, I can't analyze it. And a lot of people are quite concerned about suppression of data. And it's an issue whenever you deal with administrative government data. If the activity in question is somehow perhaps controversial, they might suppress the data. And obviously, if that's a significant problem, then our data would be compromised.
My name is Yongjun Cha. I'm studying public policy at the University of Albany. My question is simple. When you studied the comparative agendas project, did you have any image of a good government in your mind?
Say it again?
Did you have an image of good government in your mind when you
An
started the
image
project?
of good government?
Yeah.
No. One of the key issues that we've studied throughout, but this is a theoretical question and it's not a database question. One of the key issues that Brian Jones and I have written about is how smoothly do governments adjust policy outputs to changing social conditions? And the answer is not very smoothly. We've written that governments do two things best: nothing and overreacting. But that's a theoretical finding. I mean, that's a finding rather than a model that we had. I think if we had a perfect, cybernetic, perfectly rational government entity that could respond to changing social conditions, to ameliorate those conditions and keep them, if it knew exactly that the poverty rate was increasing and it could adjust the poverty rate to keep it to the absolute minimum and improve people's well-being, then the responses would be gradual, immediate, transparent, and proportionate to changes in the severity of the problem. So we've addressed that many times by looking at budgets and policy attention to different topics, and we've never found anything that remotely resembles that. But we have seen differences in the level to which the policy process lurches, and the levels of inefficiency differ across governments. But the fact that they're quite inefficient does not change, unfortunately.
Thanks. In the past decades, in natural sciences and the medical sciences, we have seen that they have adopted lots of new practices. For example, open access, publication, and open data. And they have many of the subjects have moved away from double-blind review to non-anonymous review, and sometimes they even pay reviewers. Could you foresee that kind of trend being spilled over to social sciences and public policy? And how, for example, if we move from double-blind review, which is the norm for the moment, and then to non-anonymous real-name review, how would that kind of practices change the landscape of public policy research community? Thank you.
I think that the pressures involved in the publication, the financial pressures on the journals and book publishers are the same in many fields. I think they're more extreme in some of the natural sciences and medicine. So we're going to address those same problems about the cost of journals and publication access. I don't see how there'd be anything, I guess I'm not aware of a shift in policy away from blind review. I feel like there's definitely shifts in the financial model associated with journal publication and book publications, but not a shift, and I don't foresee in the social sciences a shift away from blind review. And many things are single blind review anyway already. Book projects, grant proposals, they're single blind. The reviewer knows who the author is, but not vice versa. I don't see a problem with that. Journals, for whatever reason, aren't done that way, and I don't see them likely to change, but I think the question might be posed to any of us in the audience because I'm not particularly an expert on the review process. But I don't see that changing for us.
Yes, here. Yeah, yesterday there was an interesting presentation from Professor Capano, and he seems to depart from a concern similar to yours, dealing with the cumulative knowledge building, a concern of the fragmentation of the knowledge. The difference is that he manages theories and frameworks, probably to build up a more broad and comprehensive theoretical ground. Are you aware of this kind of effort? Do you see something that could be shared from your experience to his?
I think all of us share a desire for larger collaboration, and what I've tried to focus on is a style of data collection and I think it's amenable to any range and any number of theoretical perspectives, but I guess I don't have any more comment than that, I think it's a shared interest.
Well, okay, I think we should probably give Frank Baumgartner a rest after this now. He's been getting...
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to come and share your wisdom with us. And you'll be around for the rest of the conference. So hopefully if you have other questions, you can catch them individually. Thanks for being here.